Welcome to Dice and Quills, where the art of storytelling meets the roll of the dice. I am Darren Ruckle, professional game master and TTRPG writer, here to share the craft behind world building, adventure design, and running unforgettable games. Whether you're a fellow creator, an aspiring pro, or a lifelong player, you're in the right place. So sharpen your quills, ready your dice, and let's dive into the worlds we imagine. Today, we're getting real about something most game masters will face eventually, whether they admit it or not. The moment your campaign starts to die. Not a TPK, not a blow-up, not a dramatic walkout, just decay. Players show up, but the spark is gone. Momentum stalls. Sessions start feeling like obligations. You start prepping out of guilt instead of excitement. And deep down, you know something's changed. And not for the better. This is what I call a slow fade campaign, and it's one of the hardest things to recover from, because it doesn't announce itself. It doesn't give you a clean point of failure. It creeps in, quiet, eroding your energy, your player buy-in, and your narrative cohesion session by session, until finally someone says, maybe we just take a break. And that break? It's the end. You know it. They know it. Nobody wants to admit it, but the campaign's already dead. But here's the good news. It doesn't have to end that way. This episode is about spotting the signs early, understanding what's really causing the drift, and knowing what to do about it. Because your campaign isn't dying because you lost control. It's dying because something important got out of sync. Maybe the tone, maybe the stakes, maybe the social contract. But whatever it is, it can be brought back if you move early and with clarity. We're going to talk about how to recognize the first signs of a drifting table and how to tell the difference between a dip and a decay. Why campaigns lose energy even when the story is going fine. How to repair trust and buy-in without rebooting the whole game. And when to let go, not in failure, but in intention. So let's start with that feeling. The first ripple of doubt in your gut that tells you something's off. Maybe it's small. One player seems less engaged. You notice fewer notes being taken. The table gets quieter in scenes that used to spark discussion. Jokes fall flat. Questions dry up. Maybe you tell yourself it's just a phase. They're tired. It was a weird week. We're just in a slower part of the story. And maybe that's true. But if you're a GM long enough, you learn to tell the difference between a temporary lull and a drift. A lull is a session, maybe two. A drift is when the energy doesn't bounce back, even when the session is good on paper. You run a solid arc, you prep solid encounters, you hit your beats, and the players smile, thank you, and log off. But something's missing. That edge, that spark, that feeling that they can't wait to come back. And if you're honest, you feel it too. Your prep gets lighter. Your notes get vaguer. You spend more time staring at your campaign doc than writing in it. Because your story might still be moving, but nobody's driving. That's the moment to act. Not when the sessions start getting skipped. Not when someone drops out. Not when you're scrambling to fake enthusiasm you don't feel. You act when the feeling shows up. Because by the time the signs are visible, the rot's already taken hold. And I know how easy it is to deny it. You don't want to admit the story is off track. You don't want to believe the players aren't hooked anymore. You don't want to see the dip in your own motivation as something structural. But if you don't name it, you can't fix it. So before you start troubleshooting mechanics or arcs or pacing, you do this. You ask yourself, quietly, privately, without ego, do I still believe in this campaign? Not, do I still want to run it? Not, am I excited for the next scene? Do I still believe that this story, with these people, matters? If the answer is yes, we keep going. And if the answer is no, then we talk about how to end with purpose, not drift. But before we go there, let's assume the answer is yes. You still care. You still believe in the campaign. So let's assume you still believe in the campaign. You care about the world. You care about the players. You want this to work, but the energy is gone, and nothing obvious broke. The plot's still moving, The characters are still present. There's no major conflict, no social rift, no dramatic failure. So what happened? In most cases, when a campaign starts to lose steam, it's because the players stopped seeing themselves in the story. Not because the world got boring, not because the plot failed, but because their presence in the world stopped feeling consequential. Their choices don't change much. Their arcs feel stalled. The scenes go on without them. So they show up, they roll dice, they smile, but they're not invested. And that's where the drift starts. Because when a player doesn't see their own story reflected in the game, they disengage, quietly, politely, gradually. And before you know it, the party is just a group of people reacting to events, not driving them. So the question becomes, when did they stop steering? Because somewhere along the way, your campaign shifted from responsive to static. Maybe it was a railroaded arc. Maybe it was a villain that didn't land. Maybe you got busy and started prepping plot instead of possibilities. Whatever it was, the story stopped bending around the players and started pulling them along behind it. And when that happens, they stop showing up emotionally, not because they don't like the game, but because the game doesn't need them anymore. So if you want to recover a dying campaign, the first real step is this: return the story to the players. Not just by asking what they want, by proving that their actions matter again. That means consequences. That means callbacks. That means moments of spotlight that change something. You remind them, this world moves when you do. You say, in scene and structure, this campaign is still yours. Because when players feel ownership again, the spark returns. And once it does, we can start fanning it into real momentum. So let's talk about that pivot. Because when a campaign starts to slip, a lot of game masters panic and do the same thing. They throw more story at it. More plot twists, more villains, more reveals, more world events. Maybe a time skip, maybe a prophecy, maybe a new threat on the horizon. But here's the problem. If your players are already feeling disengaged, adding more story without giving them ownership just makes it worse. It's like yelling louder in a language they've stopped listening to. What they need isn't more story. They need more control. They need to feel like they're inside the machinery of the world, not watching it roll by from a passenger seat. So how do you do that? How do you shift a campaign from plot-driven to player-driven without scrapping everything? You start with two questions. 1. What do your players care about? Not what their characters care about. What your players lean into. What scenes get the table talking after session? What NPCs make them sit up? What conflicts they revisit on their own? You make a list. Doesn't have to be long. 3 or 4 things. And then you do this. You make those things move. Not appear. Not reappear. Move. You show that the parts of the world that matter to them are still active, still dangerous, still unfinished. The rival gang they humiliated last arc? They've adapted. They've gotten smarter. The town they saved 5 sessions ago? It's falling apart again, but this time, because of the players' earlier choices. The NPC they trusted, they're in trouble and won't survive without help. You build tension around what they care about. That's what pulls them back in. Because now the world isn't just full of new problems. It's full of relevant ones. The second question is this. What's the one thing in your campaign that only the players can do? Not in terms of prophecy, or power, or role. I mean emotionally. What's the part of the story that doesn't work without them? Is it a revolution they started? A mystery only they've seen from the inside? A relationship only they've built? You find that hinge, that thread, and you highlight it. You remind them this isn't just a story, it's their story, and it only moves when they do. Let's talk about something most game masters dread. The check-in. The moment you sit down, in person, in chat, in Discord, and you say, "Hey, I want to talk about the campaign." It feels awkward, exposing, like you're admitting failure, like you're dragging everyone into something they didn't ask for. But here's the thing. If you don't have the conversation, you're just guessing. And more often than not, your guesses are wrong. You think the players are bored with the plot. Turns out they're just tired from life. You think the pacing is too slow. They think it's moving too fast. You think the rogue is checked out. They think they're giving others room to shine. Assumptions kill campaigns faster than burnout ever could. So you check in, not defensively, not desperately, not like a teacher asking, "Are you still having fun?" You check in like a collaborator. You say, "Hey, I've been feeling like the energy's dipped a bit. Not in a bad way, but I want to make sure I'm still building the kind of story you're excited about. Anything you want more of? Less of? Any parts that feel stuck or hard to care about?" Keep it open. Keep it neutral. Keep it about improving the experience, not saving it from collapse. And here's the real magic. Sometimes just having the conversation is enough to reignite the table. Because it reminds your players that this isn't just your campaign. It's theirs. It tells them you care, that their experience matters, that this isn't an obligation, it's a shared creation, and most of the time, they'll lean back in, they'll bring suggestions, they'll ask questions, they'll reference moments they loved, even if they'd stopped showing it. And now you're not guessing, you're aligned, which means everything you do next, it lands harder, cleaner, with more clarity. Because now the recovery isn't something you're doing to the campaign, it's something you're doing together. So let's talk about stakes. Because when a campaign starts drifting, it's usually not because the world isn't interesting. It's because the world feels safe. Not in the no one can die sense. In the nothing changes if we don't act sense. That's what kills momentum. Because when players sense that the story will keep going, with or without them, they disengage. Not because they don't care, but because the pressure's gone. Their presence feels optional. And when something feels optional, it gets deprioritized. So if you want to bring the campaign back to life, you need to reintroduce stakes, not punishment, pressure, not danger, urgency. You don't need to threaten the party with annihilation. You just need to remind them that the world is moving, and it's not waiting. Maybe an enemy faction makes a bold move. Maybe an NPC ally is taken off the board. Maybe a clock that's been in the background suddenly ticks forward, visibly, dramatically. And most importantly, maybe it's the result of something they did or failed to do. Because stakes don't just come from threat, they come from agency. A consequence hits harder when it grows out of the player's own choices. They spared someone. Now that someone's back, with reinforcements. They ignored a warning. Now the fallout's spreading. They made a deal. Now it's time to pay. It doesn't have to be lethal. It has to be felt. And when it is, the table starts to lean forward again. Not because they're afraid, but because they're reinvested. They remember that their choices shape the world. And that reminder? It's often the exact thing your campaign needs to shake off the dust and start moving again. But timing matters. Reintroduce stakes too soon, and it feels manipulative, too late, and it's just noise. So you time it with alignment, with check-in, with clarity. And when it lands, when the players feel the tension again, you're not just rescuing the campaign, you're reviving it. Let's talk about the reset episode. Because sometimes, even when the story's still standing and the players are still present, the campaign just needs a breath. Not a reboot, not a retcon, just a change in rhythm. A palate cleanser to shake off the drift and remind everyone that the world is alive. I call it a reset episode, and when used intentionally, it can do more to revive a faltering campaign than any new villain or magic item ever could. Here's what it looks like. You pause the current arc. You shrink the scope. You run one tight, self-contained session, one that might even feel like a bottle episode in a TV series. Small stakes. Personal stakes. Something emotionally present. Maybe it's a festival in the city. Maybe it's a shared dream. Maybe it's an old memory that suddenly reasserts itself. One that includes the whole party in a way they don't fully understand. You give the players space to be, not just do. No world-ending events. No urgent timelines. Just a chance to reconnect. Because here's the secret. Players don't drift from a campaign because the story slows down. They drift when they stop feeling connected. to the setting, to the tone, to each other. A reset episode clears the board, just for a night. It says, let's remember why we care. Not with lore, with moments. A shared laugh, a tough conversation, an unexpected decision. You let them breathe. You let them reflect. You let them remember who they're playing and why. And when you return to the main story next session, everything feels just a little sharper, because that space, that breath, it wasn't filler, it was refocusing. And here's the beauty of it. You don't need to warn the table. You don't need to call it a reset out loud. You just plan a quieter session, a character-driven beat, a moment that invites choice without demanding outcome. And if you do it well, the players don't even realize what you've done. They just leave feeling more present, more ready, more in. So let's say you've done the work. You had the check-in. You centered player agency. You reintroduced stakes. You even ran that reset session. And it landed. The table's laughing again. They're asking questions again. They're bringing ideas to you between sessions. The game feels alive. But now you have a different kind of uncertainty. Is this momentum real? Or is it just a temporary spike? The kind that fades in 2 sessions when everything starts slipping back into old patterns. Because nothing stings more than thinking you've turned the campaign around, only to watch it falter all over again. So how do you know? How do you tell the difference between recovery and adrenaline? Here's what I watch for. First, I listen to how the players talk about the game when it's not their turn. Are they engaged with each other's scenes? Are they reacting in character? Are they asking clarifying questions? Not because they're confused, but because they're invested? That's the sign of real buy-in. Second, I look at table energy before and after the session. Did they show up early? Did they stick around after? Are they referencing old moments? Not because they feel like homework, but because they're connected? That's campaign health. Third, and this is subtle, I watch how often I have to steer. Because in a dying campaign, you're constantly driving, you're feeding scenes, prompting responses, coaxing players into motion. But when the table re-engages, you get to respond. You set a moment and they run with it. You toss a thread and it explodes into motion. You stop carrying the story and start facilitating it again. That's when you know the recovery is real. But here's the warning. Don't ease up just because the players lean back in. That momentum needs reinforcing. You need to keep tying scenes to player choices. Keep consequences alive. Keep listening. Because recovery is a phase, not an event. You're rebuilding trust. And trust takes time. Let's talk about endings, not collapses, not ghostings, not the slow fizzle where people stop showing up and nobody wants to say it's over. I mean a real ending. A moment where you, as the GM, say, I think it's time to close this story, and I want to do it right. Because the truth is, not every campaign can be saved. Not because you failed, but because people change. Schedules shift. Emotional investments move. And what burned hot in session 3 might not carry the same heat in session 30. And that's okay. What's not okay is letting the story die in silence. Dragging it across the finish line out of guilt. Or worse, pretending it's still alive when everyone knows it's not. So how do you end well? You start with honesty. You tell your players what you're feeling. Not in a big speech. Not with defensiveness. Just clarity. Hey, I think we're nearing the natural end of this campaign, and I want us to land it together. And then you ask them what kind of ending they want. Do they want a clean epilogue? A final arc? A wild send-off? Or just one more session? Something that wraps the emotional threads, even if the plot doesn't get a full conclusion. You involve them in the exit, just like you involved them in the entrance. Because this story was never just yours. Then you build the close. Tight, intentional, resonant. You call back to early choices. You bring back symbols, places, characters, anything that reminds the players of what they built. And then you give them space to choose. Not just how to win, how to leave. Let them decide what legacy their characters leave behind, what the world remembers, what they walk away from, or walk toward. That's what gives closure weight. And when the final scene ends, celebrate, not with applause, with reflection. Remind them what they accomplished. Remind them what this game was. Even if it wasn't perfect, even if it didn't end where you thought it would, because a campaign that ends on purpose, that's not a failure. That's a success with a period at the end. So let's bring it all home. Campaigns drift, even the great ones, even the ones with brilliant players and deep prep and emotional arcs that once had everyone at the edge of their seats. It happens. Life shifts. Energy dips. Focus slips. And before you know it, you're prepping out of habit instead of inspiration, and the table's just going through the motions. But that doesn't mean the story is dead. It means it's asking for attention. And if you've been hearing that whisper, the one that says something's off, this is your moment to act. Not with panic, with clarity. Because you know what to do. You check in with your players. Honestly, early, without shame. You bring the story back to them. Their choices, their arcs, their weight in the world. You reintroduce pressure, not punishment, just proof that what they do matters. You offer space, a reset episode, a breath, and you watch. Not for perfection, but for re-engagement, for curiosity, for moments where the game starts moving again, not because you pushed harder, but because the players stepped forward. And if that doesn't come, you close it with intention. You land it with love. Because not every campaign is built to last forever. But every campaign deserves to end like it mattered. Next time on Dice and Quills, we're talking about what to do between campaigns. The liminal space, the aftercare, the player shuffle, the question of what's next, and how to prep the right game for your table's next chapter. Until next time, sharpen your quills. Ready your dice. And remember, a drifting campaign isn't a failure. It's a chance to lead and to listen.